In the spring of 33 AD, a prisoner was brought before him. Not just any prisoner, a man the whole region had heard of, a man who had healed the sick, walked on water, and raised the dead, or so the rumors said. The king had waited a long time for this moment. His name was Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, son of the great Herod the Great. And on this particular morning he was thrilled, because the man standing before him in chains, this Jesus of Nazareth, was someone Herod had desperately wanted to meet for years. He had questions for him, many questions, and he expected answers. What he got instead would haunt the rest of his life. What happened to Herod Antipas after that morning? History mostly forgot him. The Bible barely mentions his end, but the record exists, buried in the works of the ancient historian Josephus. And the story it tells is one of the most dramatic falls from power in the ancient world. A king stripped of everything, exiled to the edge of the known world, destroyed by the one man he trusted most. This is the untold story of what happened to Herod Antipas, the man who mocked Jesus after the cross. To understand why Herod Antipas made the choices he made, you have to understand the world he was born into. His father, Herod the Great, was one of the most powerful rulers the ancient world had ever seen. A builder of impossible scale, the man who rebuilt the Second Temple in Jerusalem into one of the most magnificent structures on earth. A political survivor who had outlasted wars, Roman emperors, and family conspiracies. But Herod the Great was also a paranoid, violent man. By the time he died in 4 BC, he had executed 3 of his own sons. He had 10 wives and 15 children, and they all wanted a share of his kingdom. When Herod the Great died, Rome didn't give his kingdom to any single heir. Instead, they split it. Archelaus got Judea and Samaria. Philip got the northeastern territories. And Herod Antipas, the son of a Samaritan woman named Malthus, got Galilee and Perea. Not a king, a tetrarch, a ruler of a quarter of a kingdom. The title gnawed at him his entire life. Galilee was not a bad territory. It was fertile, well populated, and strategically positioned along major trade routes. The Sea of Galilee in the north, the Jordan Valley running south. This was some of the most productive land in the entire region. Fishing, agriculture, trade. Caravans moving east toward Damascus, west toward the coast. Herod Antipas ruled it for over 40 years, longer than almost any ruler in the region's history. He was a builder, like his father. He rebuilt the town of Sepphoris from near ruin into a grand Greco-Roman city. He constructed roads, aqueducts, public buildings. And then, around 20 AD, he did something more ambitious. He founded an entirely new city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, and named it Tiberias, named deliberately after the reigning Roman emperor. Tiberias was a political statement as much as a city. It said, "I am loyal. I am a friend of Rome. I am the kind of ruler you can trust." The emperor Tiberias was not a warm man. He had spent the later years of his reign in self-imposed isolation on the island of Capri, governing through letters and trusted intermediaries, suspicious of almost everyone. But Tiberius valued 2 things above all: stability and loyalty. And a client ruler who caused no trouble, managed a difficult border, paid his obligations to Rome, and named his greatest city after you were sending a message that Tiberias knew how to receive. For over 2 decades, that message kept Herod Antipas secure. Tiberias had no reason to trouble a ruler who gave him no reason to. And Herod, left alone, prospered. What Herod failed to fully reckon with was how completely that security rested on a single relationship. While Tiberias lived, Herod had a patron. The moment Tiberias died, that protection would vanish as if it had never existed. And there was nothing, no city, no title, no decades of loyalty, that could replace it. For decades it worked, but the foundation of Herod Antipas's reign rested on more than loyalty to Rome. It rested on a marriage, and when he chose to break that marriage, he set in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy him. For much of his reign, Herod Antipas maintained a crucial alliance through his wife. Her name was Phasaelis, and she was the daughter of Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. The Nabatean kingdom controlled the great desert trade routes to the south and east. Petra, their capital carved into rose-red cliffs, was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Aretas IV was wealthy, powerful, and fiercely proud. The marriage between Herod and Phasaelis was political by design, a bond between 2 dynasties, a guarantee of peace on Herod's most vulnerable borders. For years it held. What destroyed it was a trip to Rome. At some point around 27 or 28 AD, Herod Antipas visited the city and stayed with his half-brother Philip. Philip had a wife, Herodias, granddaughter of Herod the Great, beautiful and sharp, and possessed of an ambition that made Galilee feel like a small stage. By the time Herod Antipas returned to his territory, he had made her a promise. He would divorce Phasaelis and marry Herodias instead. What Herod didn't anticipate was that Phasaelis would find out before he told her. How she learned of the plan is unknown. Josephus does not explain it, but she did learn of it, and she acted quickly. She asked her husband, with every appearance of innocence, if she might be permitted to travel to the fortress of Machaerus, on the eastern edge of his territory, a border fortress, a place that sat on the boundary between Herod's land and her father's kingdom. Herod agreed. He had no reason to suspect anything. Once Phasaelis reached Machaerus, she sent word to her father. And then she walked across the border into Nabatean territory and never came back. The humiliation burned in Aretas IV like a coal. His daughter had been cast aside. The alliance had been shattered. And Aretas, a man who had ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world for over 30 years, was not the kind of man who absorbed that kind of insult quietly. He waited. He planned, and when the moment arrived, he moved. But first, a prophet would have his say. Around 28 AD, a man appeared in the wilderness of Judea. He wore animal skins, ate locusts and wild honey, and preached repentance with a ferocity that hadn't been seen in generations. People came from across the region to hear him, from Jerusalem, from Galilee, from the towns along the Jordan. His name was John, and among the sins he preached against most loudly was one that struck very close to the palace. Because the moment Herod Antipas divorced his Nabatean wife and took Herodias, his half-brother's wife, John stood up and said what everyone was thinking but no one with anything to lose dared to say. "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Those words spread through Galilee and Judea like fire. In the markets, on the roads, at the synagogues. Everywhere Herod went, those words had already been. Herodias was furious. She wanted John dead. Herod Antipas hesitated. He knew John was popular. Executing him could trigger unrest across Galilee. He also knew, according to Josephus, that something in him feared John privately. He recognized in the prophet something he couldn't name, something that kept him awake, something true. So instead of killing him, he imprisoned him. In the fortress of Machaerus, the very same border fortress where his first wife had once stopped to send word to her father before slipping out of his life forever. That was his first mistake, because Herodias did not forget, and she did not forgive. She waited. Her opportunity came at Herod's birthday banquet. The exact date is unknown, but scholars place it around 29 or 30 AD. Herod held a grand birthday celebration. His court assembled, military commanders, local nobles, the leading men of Galilee. Wine flowed, music played. Into the gathering stepped a young girl. The Gospel of Mark calls her simply the daughter of Herodias. Later tradition names her Salome, though the Gospels do not. She danced, and Herod was so pleased that he made a reckless oath. "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. Up to half my kingdom." The girl went to her mother, and her mother told her exactly what to ask for. When she returned, she made her request. She wanted the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The texts say Herod was grieved. He hadn't wanted this. He'd walked into a trap set by his own wife, sprung by his own stepdaughter, in front of his own commanders. He could not back down, not with those men watching, not without losing face. He gave the order. John the Baptist was beheaded that night. His disciples came, took his body, and buried it. When Jesus heard the news, he withdrew to a desolate place. The execution sent a message through the region. It told the people of Galilee exactly what kind of ruler Herod Antipas was. A man who could be manipulated. A man whose vanity could override his judgment. And the people remembered, because what came next, many of them saw as a direct consequence. Around 36 AD, Aretas IV finally moved. The Nabatean king launched a military campaign against Herod's territory. It was not a border skirmish, it was a full invasion, and Herod's army was destroyed. Josephus writes about the defeat with unusual directness. Some of Herod's own troops defected during the battle. Men from territories that had once belonged to Philip the tetrarch. Men whose loyalties were to someone other than the man who had once imprisoned a prophet for political convenience. The army that had secured Galilee's eastern border for decades was crushed. The defeat was so complete, so humiliating, that it sparked a theological debate across the region. Many Jews, Josephus records, believed the destruction was divine punishment. God's response to what Herod had done to John the Baptist. The prophet's blood had been paid for in soldiers. Herod Antipas did the only thing he could do. He sent an urgent appeal to Rome. At this point, the emperor was Tiberias, the same man after whom Herod had named his prized capital city. Their relationship had always been one of careful mutual utility. Herod was loyal, predictable, useful, exactly what Rome wanted from a client king on a difficult border. Tiberias responded. He ordered Vitellius, his governor of Syria, to march against Aretas and restore order. The campaign began, and then, in March of 37 AD, Tiberias died. The emperor who had protected Herod Antipas's interests for over 2 decades was gone. The new emperor was a young man named Gaius, known to history as Caligula. and Caligula's loyalties were not with Herod Antipas. When Vitellius received news of the emperor's death, he halted his campaign immediately. The army turned back. The Nabateans were never punished. Aretas kept his gains, and Herod Antipas was left facing a new political reality. The man now on the Roman throne was not his patron. He was his nephew's closest friend. But before any of that came to a head, before Agrippa, before Rome, before the trap, there was one more encounter, the most important encounter of Herod Antipas's life. After the execution of John, a disturbing rumor reached the palace. A new preacher had arisen in Galilee, more powerful than John. He performed miracles openly, feeding thousands on a hillside, healing men who had been blind since birth, and according to the most extraordinary reports, raising the dead. His followers said he was the Messiah. Some called him the Son of God. When Herod Antipas first heard the reports, something inside him broke open. This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. The guilt had never left him, not truly. And now it seemed to be walking the roads of Galilee in sandals, drawing crowds, performing the kind of wonders John had never performed. He wanted to see this man, needed to know. Was this John, returned from the dead? Was this something else entirely, something worse? When Jesus learned that Herod wanted to meet him, he sent back a reply that must have stung. He called Herod, the tetrarch, the ruler, the man with soldiers and palaces, and the power of life and death over an entire territory, a fox. And then he kept moving through Galilee, preaching, healing, gathering followers, never coming to the palace, never granting the audience Herod wanted. For years the two men circled each other at a distance, the ruler and the preacher, the palace and the road. Then came the spring of 33 A.D., and everything changed. During Passover, Jerusalem was packed. Pilgrims from across the Roman world had flooded the city. The population, normally around 80,000, had swelled to several times that number. The streets were dense, volatile, thick with religious tension. It was in this crowded city that Jesus of Nazareth was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, tried before the high priest Caiaphas through the night, and brought at dawn to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pilate questioned him. He found no crime worthy of death. But then someone pointed out a useful fact. Jesus was Galilean, and the ruler of Galilee, Herod Antipas, was in Jerusalem for the Passover festival, staying at the Hasmonean palace on the western hill. Pilate saw an opportunity to pass a difficult problem to someone else. He sent Jesus to Herod. And Herod Antipas, the man who had wanted this meeting for years, was, according to the Gospel of Luke, exceedingly glad. He had heard so much, wondered so long. Here, finally, was his chance, face to face with the man who had occupied his thoughts since the night John died in the dungeons of Machaerus. He began to ask questions, many of them. Jesus said nothing, not a word, not a single answer, not a denial, not a defense, not a miracle, not even an acknowledgement that the questions had been asked. He simply stood there, bound, bloodied from the night's beatings, looking at the tetrarch with an expression the texts do not describe, but which, given everything we know about what came before and after, must have been among the most unsettling things Herod Antipas had ever seen. The silence in that hall must have been excruciating. For a man like Herod, it was an insult of the highest order. He had offered this prisoner an audience. He had prepared questions. He was ready, perhaps, to be genuinely moved, and the bound man from Nazareth simply would not speak. What followed was humiliation dressed as comedy. Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus. They dressed him in a gorgeous, expensive robe, the kind a king or nobleman would wear, and treated the whole scene as entertainment. Look at the prophet who won't speak. Look at the miracle worker who won't perform. Look at the king of the Jews in chains before the actual ruler of Galilee. Then Herod sent him back to Pilate. The Gospels record something worth noting. Before that morning, Herod Antipas and Pontius Pilate had been enemies. After it, they became friends. A shared contempt had bonded them. They had each looked at the same prisoner and made the same choice. Jesus was crucified that afternoon on a hill outside the city walls, and Herod Antipas returned to his palace, satisfied that he had finally gotten what he wanted. He had no idea what he had just thrown away. Herod Agrippa had grown up in Rome. He was the grandson of Herod the Great, the son of Aristobulus, one of the sons Herod the Great had executed. Raised partly in the imperial court, educated alongside the children of senators and emperors, he had developed the kind of connections that money alone could never buy. He was charming in the way that only certain people who've had nothing are charming, with a particular ease, a particular warmth, a particular gift for making powerful people feel seen. His one persistent problem was money. He spent far beyond any income he had, borrowed from anyone who would lend, and eventually found himself so deep in debt that he had to leave Rome in disgrace and return to the East to survive. For a time, he turned to his uncle. Herod Antipas gave him a position in his administration, a minor post, a salary, enough to live on, not enough to satisfy a man of Agrippa's habits and ambitions. The relationship deteriorated. There were arguments. Agrippa reportedly made comments about the tetrarch's dependence on Rome that were carried back to Antipas's ears. Antipas, insulted, dismissed him. Agrippa left. He went back to Rome, and then his old friend Caligula became emperor. Caligula and Agrippa had known each other since youth. The bond between them was genuine and deep. When Caligula took the throne, Agrippa's entire situation transformed within months. Caligula gave him territory, the northeastern regions formerly ruled by Philip the Tetrarch, and with those territories came a title, King, Herod Agrippa. I returned to the east as a king. His uncle, Herod Antipas, was still only a tetrarch. This was, for Herodias, intolerable. She had not endured years of scandal, public condemnation from a prophet, the murder of that prophet, the humiliation of a military defeat. She had not survived all of that. To watch Agrippa sail back into the region, wearing a crown that should belong to her husband. She pushed, night after night. Go to Rome, request an audience, demand the title that is rightfully yours. Herod Antipas resisted. He was 60 years old. He had ruled Galilee for 4 decades by being careful, by never overreaching, by reading the currents of Roman politics with the patience of a man who knew that one wrong move could cost everything. He understood something Herodias apparently didn't. Caligula's friend was Agrippa, not him. But Herodias would not stop. And so, in the year 39 AD, Herod Antipas made the journey to Rome. He was walking into a trap. He just didn't know it yet. Herod Agrippa knew his uncle was coming. He knew why, and he moved first. Before Herod Antipas even arrived in Rome, Agrippa sent messengers ahead with letters addressed to the emperor. The accusations were specific and devastating. Agrippa claimed that Herod Antipas had been in secret contact with Artabanus, king of Parthia, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates, the empire that had never been conquered, the source of Rome's most persistent strategic anxiety. He claimed that Herod had been stockpiling weapons. Enough arms, the letter said, to equip 70,000 soldiers. This was not the petition of a tetrarch wanting a title upgrade. This was the profile of a man preparing a rebellion against Rome. Whether the accusations were true is debated by historians to this day. Josephus does not render a verdict on their truthfulness. He records what was alleged and what happened next. What happened next was swift and merciless. When Herod Antipas arrived before Caligula, the emperor confronted him with Agrippa's accusations directly. And there was the trap, sprung at last. Herod Antipas could not deny the weapons, because the weapons existed, whatever their purpose. The security instinct of a border ruler, decades of accumulated military supplies, perfectly ordinary precaution by the standards of any regional tetrarch. The weapons were real, and the number was roughly correct. He could not explain his way out of it, not to Caligula, not with Agrippa's letters sitting on the table. The verdict was immediate. In the year 39 A.D., the Emperor Caligula stripped Herod Antipas of his tetrarchy, Galilee, Perea. The cities he had built, the palace at Tiberias that bore the emperor's own name, everything gone. The territories were handed to Herod Agrippa, and Herod Antipas was sent into exile. The destination, according to Josephus, was Lugdunum, the Roman colony we know today as Lyon, in what is now southern France. Some later manuscripts suggest Spain. The precise location remains uncertain, but the essential reality is the same. He was being sent to the farthest reachable corner of the Western Empire, far from Jerusalem, far from the Sea of Galilee, far from the warmth, the politics, the history that had been the substance of his entire life. Then something unexpected happened. Caligula turned to Herodias. He knew who she was. She was Agrippa's sister, the sister of the man who had just orchestrated her husband's destruction, and perhaps feeling something like mercy toward his friend's kin, Caligula offered her an exemption. She didn't have to go. She could remain. She could keep her wealth. Herodias looked at the offer, and she refused. Whatever her faults, and the Gospels and Josephus record them at length, she would not leave her husband in his ruin. She had pushed him toward Rome. She had helped create this disaster with her ambition, and now that the disaster had arrived, she chose to follow him into it. She went with Herod to Lugdunum, to the edge of the world. The journey itself would have taken weeks. By ship from Rome along the coast of Gaul, then overland through the Roman road network, through landscapes growing increasingly unfamiliar with every mile, the olive groves thinning, the language changing, the architecture becoming simpler, the sky grayer, the air colder. Herod Antipas had been born in the East. He had spent his entire life in the East. The smells of the Jordan Valley, the particular quality of light over the Sea of Galilee, the sound of Aramaic in the markets, the sight of the Temple Mount on the Jerusalem horizon, all of it receding with every league the ship traveled west. At some point on that journey, The realization must have set in fully. He was not going to Lugdunum to wait. He was going to die there. To understand what that meant, you have to understand what Lugdunum was, and what it wasn't. By Roman standards, it was not a punishment posting. Lugdunum was actually one of the most important cities in the Western Empire. Founded nearly a century earlier at the confluence of the Rhone and the Saône rivers, it was the capital of the province of Gallia Lugdunensis. It had roads, an amphitheatre, temples, baths, a mint that produced Roman coinage. It had a substantial population of Roman citizens, merchants, administrators. But it was not Jerusalem. Jerusalem sat in the hills of Judea at the crossroads of 3 continents. Its streets had been holy for 1,000 years before Herod Antipas was born. Its markets smelled of spice and incense, and pilgrims from every corner of the known world. The temple his grandfather had built still gleamed in the eastern sun. Galilee, his Galilee, the territory he had governed for 4 decades, was one of the most beautiful landscapes in the ancient world. The Sea of Galilee in the early morning, the hills rising from its banks, the fishing boats coming in at dawn, the light warm and golden even in winter. Lugdunum was grey. Its winters were cold and wet. Its skies stayed low and overcast for months at a time. The rivers were wide and powerful, but without the intimacy of the lake he had grown up beside. For a man who had built cities, named a capital after a Roman emperor, held the fate of prophets in his hands, and stood face to face with the man his subjects called the Son of God, to end up here unknown, powerless, stripped of every title and every possession. It was not punishment. It was obliteration. He had been erased. And the man who arranged his erasure, his nephew, the man he had sheltered and employed when Agrippa was broke and had nowhere else to go, was now living in his cities, ruling his people, spending his treasury. The records go quiet after this. Josephus, who chronicled the Herodian dynasty in extraordinary detail across 18 books of his Antiquities, says almost nothing about what happened in exile. He records that they went. He records the territories were given to Agrippa, and then silence. Herod Antipas, who had ruled Galilee for 43 years, disappears from history in the city of Lugdunum. No death scene, no final speech, no last words recorded by anyone, just silence. We don't know exactly when he died. Scholars place it somewhere around 39 or 40 A.D. He may have died shortly after arriving, or on the journey itself, or he may have lived for some time in that cold provincial city before his heart gave out. The records simply do not say. What we know is this: the man who built cities, commanded armies, held banquets in palaces on the shores of a golden lake, and looked a silent prisoner in the eye and chose to mock him. That man ended his days unknown, in a city no one at home had ever heard of, too far away to matter, too stripped of power to threaten anyone. The man who had taken John the Baptist's life had his own life taken from him, not by an executioner's blade, but by the slow erasure of irrelevance. Today, the city of Tiberias still exists. Herod Antipas built it. He named it after Tiberius Caesar. He intended it as a monument to his power and his Roman loyalty. A city that would outlast him and carry his political genius into the future. He was right that it would outlast him. He just didn't understand in what way. When visitors walk the shores of the Sea of Galilee today, almost none of them are thinking about Herod Antipas. They are thinking about the fishermen he once taxed, They are thinking about the water that stretches flat and silver to the hills on the far shore. The same water where, by the accounts of millions of believers across 2,000 years, a carpenter from Nazareth once walked. History has a way of deciding who it remembers. The encounter between Herod Antipas and Jesus lasted probably less than an hour. For Herod it was a disappointment. He had expected miracles. He had expected submission. He had expected to walk away feeling superior to the bound man in front of him. Instead, the prisoner's silence outlasted his kingdom. There's a detail in Luke's account worth sitting with. When Jesus stood in that hall, bound and silent, what did Herod actually see? He saw a man he couldn't break. He saw a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to lose, and nothing to fear from a king who needed an audience to feel powerful. And Herod responded, the only way men like him know how to respond to something they cannot control and cannot understand. He mocked it. He dressed it up in a fine robe and laughed at it and sent it away. He didn't know he was looking at the reason history would remember that year. Herod Antipas was not a monster in the simple sense. He was something more common, and in some ways more disturbing. He was a man who knew what was right, and consistently did what was convenient. He protected John the Baptist until his wife's ambition made protection too costly. He hesitated before the killing, genuinely hesitated, and then gave the order anyway. He recognized something real in Jesus when Jesus stood before him. Josephus makes clear he had been thinking about this man for years, and he responded with a costume and a laugh and a guard escort back to Pilate. He was a man caught his entire life between what he knew and what he wanted, between his instincts and his appetites, between the prophet he feared and the wife he feared more. And in the end, he lost everything to the one person he should have suspected most, the nephew who had once come to him with nothing, whom he had fed and employed and then dismissed, who left Galilee carrying a grievance that he nursed for years until the moment was exactly right. The fall of Herod Antipas is, at its core, a story about the cost of looking away from what John told him, looking away from what his own conscience kept returning to in the night, looking away from the prisoner who stood before him in silence and offered him, in that silence, one last chance to see clearly. He looked away, and then he sailed west, into the fog, and disappeared from history.